The smell hit Reed Calloway before anything else did. Burnt stone, old ash, something underneath it that had no name in any language he spoke, but his body recognized it anyway, the kind of smell that told a person something had died here and died badly, and the ground had not forgotten it. He stood at the edge of what the survey map called Sector 9. Locals, back when there were locals, had called it something else. He did not know what. There were no locals anymore. Drathful had been a living planet once. Reed had seen the old footage, green ridgelines, wide river deltas, settlements carved into cliff faces with a kind of beauty that only came from a people who had lived somewhere long enough to love it. The Vreth had lived on Drathful for thousands of years before the Accord War. They had built homes here, raised young here, buried their dead in the dark soil, and marked the grave with carved stone that nobody alive could read anymore. The war had taken 15 years off the calendar, and most of the Vreth off the planet. What was left looked like this. Reed adjusted the strap of his equipment bag and walked into the ruins. He was not a soldier. He had been one briefly in a different life, but that was a long time ago and a different man. Now he was a salvage contractor, licensed, bonded, operating inside the Accord's legal framework, which mostly meant he paid his quarterly fees and did not ask too many questions about what he found. The work was simple: go into the dead places, pull out anything valuable, file the paperwork, get paid. The company that hired him wanted pre-war Vreth manufacturing components, old alloy processors, power cores, optical relay units, the kind of things that were worth real money to collectors or research institutions and that the Accord hadn't gotten around to cataloging yet. Legal gray area, but that was fine. Reed had spent most of his adult life in legal gray areas. He moved through the ruins carefully. The ground was unstable in places, collapsed floors beneath layers of ash and broken stone. His boots found solid ground by instinct more than sight. He had done this kind of work on a dozen dead worlds. The body learned how to read rubble after a while. The first 2 hours turned up nothing worth taking. Melted processing units. Structural beams fused into useless shapes by whatever weapons had passed through here. A row of storage containers that had been blasted open and emptied by someone who got here long before Reed did. He was thinking about calling it and moving to the next grid sector when his scanner beeped. It was a faint reading, thermal variance buried under 6 feet of collapsed wall. His scanner flagged it as an anomaly and offered 3 possible explanations, none of which matched what he found when he spent 40 minutes carefully clearing the rubble away. 3 eggs. They were large, each one came up past Reed's knee when he crouched beside them. The shells were dark, the color of iron left out in the rain, and they were covered in fine patterns that seemed to shift when the light hit them differently, like something alive just under the surface. They were clustered together in the corner of what had once been a room, packed in around what looked like the remains of a thermal nest, a layer of heat-retaining material that the Vreth used to keep eggs warm during incubation. The nest itself was dead. The heat source had failed a long time ago. But the eggs were still warm. Reed held his bare hand against the nearest one for a long moment. Definitely warm. Not hot, not cold, but steady and even, like something that was keeping itself alive through sheer refusal to give up. He sat back on his heels and looked at them for a while. Then he pulled out his comm unit and ran a search on Vreth reproductive biology, which he had never had reason to look up before. What he found was not encouraging. Vreth eggs did not survive without external heat sources. The fact that these 3 were still viable after years in a collapsed ruin with a dead nest suggested either a miracle or something about Vreth biology that the Accord's records had gotten wrong. He ran a second search. This one was on legal status. The result came back in plain language, the way official documents always did when they wanted to make sure nobody could claim they misunderstood. Unclaimed Vreth biological material, including eggs and offspring, was classified under Accord Resolution 7 Gamma as non-citizen biological matter. In practical terms, this meant that any Vreth eggs found on unsecured territory were to be reported to the nearest Accord administrative post within 24 hours of discovery. Upon reporting, The eggs would be collected by Accord biological management units for, and here the document used a word that meant nothing on its own, processing. Reed was not a naive man. He had been around long enough to know what the Accord meant when it used words like processing in reference to things it did not want to exist. He sat with that knowledge for a little while. His job was to report the find, file the discovery form, flag the coordinates, let the Accord's machinery do what it was designed to do. He would get a small finder's fee, probably, or at least avoid the fine for non-disclosure. Clean and simple. He looked at the 3 eggs. They were still glowing faintly, pulsing almost in a slow, steady rhythm that reminded him uncomfortably of a heartbeat. Reed was quiet for a long time. Then he opened his equipment bag and started pulling out the thermal padding he used to protect fragile salvage items during transport. He worked carefully, methodically, the way he did everything. He packed the first egg, then the second, then the third. He sealed the bag, checked the temperature readings on his scanner, and adjusted the padding until the readings stabilized. He did not file a discovery form. He walked back out of the ruins the same way he had come in, stepping over the same broken stones, breathing the same burnt air. When he reached his ship, he loaded the bag into the cargo bay, ran a quick diagnostic on the ship's heating systems, and set a course off-world before the Accord's routine orbital sweep could register his landing signature. The jump took 11 minutes. When the ship came out the other side into empty fringe space, Reed went back to the cargo bay and sat down on the floor next to the equipment bag. He listened. The faint, steady pulse was still there. He leaned his head back against the cargo bay wall and looked at the ceiling. "All right," he said to nobody in particular, "guess I'm doing this." He had no plan. He had no idea how to care for dragon eggs. He had no allies, no resources beyond what was on this ship, and no legal standing of any kind in what he had just done. What he had was 3 living things that the rest of the known galaxy had decided were not worth keeping alive. He figured that was enough to start with. 3 days into open space, one of the eggs started making noise. It was not a loud noise. Reed only heard it because the ship was quiet and he had been sleeping lightly, the way he always did when something was wrong, and his body knew it before his mind caught up. He sat up in his bunk, listened, and then got up and went to the cargo bay. The middle egg was vibrating. Not cracking, not yet, but something inside it was moving, pressing against the shell in small, irregular pulses that made the whole egg shift slightly in its padding. Reed put his hand on it and felt the movement under his palm, and his heart did something complicated that he chose not to examine too closely. He pulled up everything his ship's database had on Vreth egg incubation and got very little. The Accord had never considered Vreth biological data worth preserving in detail. What Reed found was fragments, old academic papers, half-redacted research notes, a single paragraph from a xenobiology textbook that described Vreth eggs as requiring a sustained thermal environment of not less than 42 degrees and not more than 51, as well as periodic mineral supplementation in the final stages of incubation. Reed did not have mineral supplements. He spent the next 6 hours reading everything he could find and improvising everything he could not. He rigged the cargo bay's heating system to hold a steady 45 degrees. He rearranged the padding so all 3 eggs were in contact with each other, since the textbook mentioned that communal heat sharing was natural to a clutch. He found a nutritional supplement powder in his medkit that was mineral-dense and mixed it into a paste, then carefully applied it to the shell of the vibrating egg with a cloth, feeling deeply uncertain about whether this was helping or making things worse. The vibrating slowed. He took that as a good sign. The ship needed supplies. More than that, it needed biological stabilizers, compounds used in xenobiological transport that would help maintain an embryo's viability through the final incubation stage. Reed could not buy them at any standard supply point without the purchase being logged against his contractor ID. He needed somewhere that didn't ask for IDs. He set course for Dusk Pier. Dusk Pier was a station that existed in the records as a licensed refueling depot and officially processed about a third of the commerce that actually moved through it. The rest of what happened there happened quietly, between people who had reasons not to be noticed. Reed had done business there before. It was not comfortable exactly, but it was reliable. He docked 6 hours later and left the cargo bay locked and climate-controlled while he went to find what he needed. He found the biological stabilizers at the fourth stall he tried, purchased with untraceable credit chips, no names exchanged. He was on his way back to the docking corridor when the voice stopped him. "Those are Vreth eggs." Reed turned around slowly. The speaker was a Vreth, adult, clearly tall, with the broad-shouldered build of his kind, dark-scaled skin and amber eyes that caught the station's dim light and held it. He was standing near a parts stall, and he had been watching Reed, apparently, for long enough to draw a conclusion. The Vreth was missing his wings. Not neatly, the scarring on his upper back was old and irregular, the kind of damage that happened in violence rather than surgery. His name, Reed would learn, was Soren. "I don't know what you're talking about," Reed said. "I could smell the shell mineral on your hands from 6 meters, Soren said. His voice was flat and very controlled, the voice of someone who had learned to keep feeling out of his tone a long time ago. "And you just bought 2 units of incubation stabilizer with a heat trace wand still in your coat pocket. The wand is standard for late-stage clutch monitoring." He paused. "Where did you find them?" Reed looked at him for a long moment. He made a decision the way he usually made decisions, quickly, from the gut, based on limited information and the understanding that waiting for certainty was a good way to run out of time. "Drathvol," he said, "Sector 9, collapsed nest, 3 eggs still viable." Something moved across Soren's face, gone before Reed could read it fully, but it had been there. "You need to give them to me," Soren said. "No. You don't understand what you're carrying. If the Accord finds those eggs." "I know what the Accord will do with them," Reed said. "That's why I took them." Soren stared at him. For a Vreth, staring was not an idle habit, it was a form of assessment. Reed had read that somewhere. He stood still and let himself be assessed. "You're a human salvage contractor," Soren said finally. "Yes, with 3 Vreth eggs on your ship." "Yes, and your plan is what, exactly?" Reed was quiet for a moment. He was a man who preferred honesty over presentation. "Find somewhere the Accord doesn't reach," he said. "Keep them warm. Let whatever hatches have a shot at living." Soren looked at him for a very long time. "That is not a plan," he said. "I know. That is a list of 3 hopes, with no method connecting them." "Also, yes." Another silence, longer. Soren looked away, toward the far end of the docking corridor, and Reed could see something working in his expression, something heavy and old, that was deciding whether it had the energy to matter again. "I know Vreth incubation biology," Soren said at last, still not looking at Reed. "I know what the eggs need in the final stage. I know the mineral sequences, the temperature fluctuations, what sounds the shells make when something is wrong." He stopped. "I have not had a use for any of that knowledge in 15 years. "Come with me," Reed said. It was not a request exactly, but it was not quite a command either. Soren finally looked back at him. "You understand that if the Accord finds us, they will not simply take the eggs," he said. "They will take us as well, you, for theft of Accord-classified biological material, me, for existing in the wrong place at the wrong time, which has always been enough." "I know," Reed said. "And you are still willing." "I said I'd do this. I don't back out of things I've said." This time the silence was shorter. "There is a man named Gallic Ward," Soren said quietly, "Accord inspector. I saw his ship in Dock 17 when you arrived. He runs salvage violation checks on this station routinely. He will notice the supplies you bought." He picked up a small bag from under the parts stall, already packed. "We should leave now." Reed nodded, and turned toward the docking corridor. They were in the air 11 minutes later. In the cargo bay, the middle egg had gone still again, its warmth steady, its shell glowing faintly in the dark. The other two sat close against it. Soren crouched beside the eggs and put both hands carefully on the nearest one. He stayed that way for a long time, very still, his expression doing something Reed could not name. "They are close," Soren said at last. 2 weeks, maybe less. "Then we need to find nowhere faster," Reed said from the doorway. Soren looked up at him. "Nowhere." "The place I'm taking them," Reed said. "I haven't named it yet, I just call it that." Soren looked at the eggs again, then he nodded once. "Nowhere," he agreed. "Let's find it." The moon had no name, only a survey number that nobody had ever bothered to say out loud. It was small and pale, the kind of world that orbital maps described as uninhabited and resource-poor and generally passed over without comment. It had breathable air, a thin one, slightly high in nitrogen, but workable. It had flat grey ground and low hills, and a sky that was the color of dirty copper at midday and deep red at night. It had no settlements, no infrastructure, no Accord presence of any kind. Reed landed the calloused hand in a shallow basin between two hills and started setting up camp. Soren had not spoken much during the transit. He had spent most of it in the cargo bay with the eggs, checking temperatures, applying the mineral compound at intervals, listening to the shells with his ear pressed against them the way a person listens at a wall. Reed had left him to it and focused on flying. The camp was basic, a shelter frame, a portable heating unit running off the ship's secondary power. The 3 eggs arranged in the center of the shelter on a bed of thermal padding and covered loosely with a reflective blanket. Soren positioned them with a care that looked almost ceremonial, adjusting each one by small degrees until he was satisfied with the arrangement. On the first night, nothing happened. On the morning of the second day, the largest egg cracked. Reed heard it from outside the shelter, a sharp, clean sound like a knuckle popping, and then a silence, and then another crack, lower and longer. He came inside and sat down on the ground across from the eggs and watched. Soren was already there, very still, his hands resting on his knees. The crack spread slowly. A dark line ran from near the top of the egg down one side, branched twice, and then held. From inside, the shell came a sound that Reed could not have described to anyone who had not heard it, something between a hiss and a hum, insistent and rhythmic. Then a claw punched through. It was small, dark, and very sharp, and it hit the air and immediately began pulling at the shell with a focused, furious energy that was almost funny to watch given how small the claw was. The crack widened. A second claw appeared. Then the shell split properly along the line and folded outward, and something dark and damp and very much alive pushed itself out onto the thermal padding and sat there breathing hard. The hatchling was roughly the size of a large dog, dark-scaled like Soren, but with patches of deep amber along the spine that caught the light and threw it back warm. Its wings were folded flat and wet against its back. Its head was too big for its body in the way that young things often were, wide-eyed and slightly unsteady. It was making a sound continuously, not a cry exactly, more of a low, urgent announcement. Then it turned its head and looked directly at Reed. It stayed like that for what felt like a long time. Then it walked toward him on legs that were not entirely sure of themselves yet, sat down against his knee, and went quiet. Reed looked at Soren. Soren was looking at the hatchling with an expression that had nothing controlled in it at all. After a moment, he turned away and made a small, sharp motion with one hand that might have been dismissal or might have been something else entirely. "Dravon," Soren said quietly. It was a Vreth word. Reed did not ask what it meant. The second egg began to crack that afternoon. His hatching was quieter. The shell came apart more slowly, almost delicately, and what emerged was smaller than the first, narrow in build, with pale silver along the edges of her scales that Soren said was unusual, a trait that appeared sometimes in certain Vreth bloodlines and was considered a mark of clarity of mind. She did not make the announcement sound that the first one had made. She sat in the broken shell for a long time, and looked at everything carefully before she moved. She eventually moved towards Soren. She touched his hand with her nose once and then settled against his side. Sealer, Soren said. His voice was not controlled at all. The third egg took until the following morning. Soren had been right that something about this one was different. The shell was thicker than the other two, and what was inside it seemed in no hurry. Reed and Soren had taken turns through the night checking the temperature, applying the mineral compound, listening. Twice Soren had heard sounds that concerned him, and Reed had gone to the ship and adjusted the heating output. When the third hatchling finally came out, it was immediately obvious why it had taken longer. It was the largest of the three by a significant margin. Broader, denser, built like something that had decided, somewhere in the shell, to take up more space than originally planned. Its scales were dark green-black, and it had a row of small ridges along the top of its head that the other two did not have. It sat in the ruins of its shell and looked at nothing in particular for a while, apparently entirely unbothered by having just arrived in the world. Then it sneezed, and a small but impressive jet of flame shot out, singeing the edge of Reed's boot. Reed yanked his foot back. The hatchling looked at the singed boot with an expression that communicated absolutely no remorse. Wrath, Soren said, and there was something in his voice that, if Reed had been asked to name it, he would have called relief, the unguarded, total kind. The three hatchlings were fed. Soren had been preparing for this, had sourced high-protein concentrates from Dusk Pier, and they ate with an enthusiasm that made the process slightly chaotic. Dravan kept trying to steal from Sealer's portion. Wrath ate his own portion, Dravan's portion after Dravan abandoned it to go investigate a strange smell near the shelter wall, and then attempted to eat part of the thermal blanket, which Reed removed from his mouth 3 times before Wrath accepted that it was not food. That evening the three of them slept in a pile, Dravan against Reed's leg, Wrath spread-eagled in the center of the thermal padding. Sealer curled at Soren's side with one small wing extended across the other two as if she was keeping count. Reed and Soren sat outside the shelter in the copper-colored evening and said nothing for a while. "You did not expect this," Soren said finally, "not an accusation, an observation." "I expected to keep the eggs alive," Reed said. "I didn't really plan past that." Soren looked out at the hills. "None of those three should exist," he said. "By the Accord's accounting, they are a violation, a problem, something that needs to be resolved." He paused. "But here they are." "Here they are," Reed agreed. Inside the shelter, Wrath made a sound in his sleep. Dravan immediately made a louder sound in response, then silence again. Reed was quiet for a long moment, then he looked at the sky. The red of evening was deepening to something close to black at the edges, and the stars were coming through, the particular cold indifference of fringe space stars that had never been given names. "There is a probe," Soren said, without changing his tone. "Where?" "Orbital, short-range type. It has been there for approximately 4 hours." He glanced at Reed. "I saw it when I went to check the external temperature sensors. I did not want to say so in front of the hatchlings." Reed looked at the sky for a moment longer. "Then we have time," he said. "Not much, but some." "What do we do with the time?" Reed thought about it. Running had a limit. Running only worked until it didn't, and then you were out of options and out of room. He had seen that happen to people who ran long enough, the specific exhaustion of a life spent always one step behind the thing chasing you. He did not want that life for the three hatchlings asleep inside the shelter. "We stop running," he said, "and we figure out how to make them stop chasing." Soren looked at him. "That is still not a plan," he said. "Give me the night," Reed said. "I'll have one by morning." The probe was still there at dawn. Reed had been awake most of the night. Not packing, he was not a pacer. He had sat at the fold-out desk in the ship's small side cabin with his personal terminal open and every legal file he could access pulled up in front of him, reading. He had 2 cups of cold caffeine and a growing pile of handwritten notes on actual paper, because actual paper could not be scanned by a ship's passive sensor sweep, and old habits from field work died hard. Soren came in around the second hour of the night and said nothing. He sat down on the opposite side of the cabin and began writing his own notes. They worked in parallel without speaking. Outside, the three hatchlings slept. By the time the copper light of the moon's morning started coming through the porthole, Reed had found what he was looking for. Resolution 7 Gamma was the Accord law that classified unclaimed Vreth biological material as non-citizen matter subject to disposal. It was also, Reed had found after 4 hours of reading through legislative records that were publicly available but practically unreadable, passed under emergency wartime powers during the last year of the Accord War. Emergency wartime powers, under Accord Constitutional Provision 14, were valid for a maximum of 8 years from the date of passage, unless formally renewed by a full Accord Council vote. Resolution 7 Gamma had never been renewed. It had expired 9 years ago. Every enforcement action taken under it since that date existed in legal grey territory that any independent court in the Accord system would struggle to uphold. That was the first thing. The second thing was that the Accord's own definition of sapient young, under Biological Rights Accord Supplement 3, included any organism displaying post-hatching cognitive response, individual personality differentiation, and voluntary social bonding before the age of 30 standard days. Reed had watched Draven walk toward him and choose to stay. He had watched Seela assess her entire environment before deciding where to go. He had watched Wrath eat a thermal blanket with sustained personal commitment. 3 hatchlings, 30 days to file, 2 weeks to get a filing in front of an independent review board. The third thing was Wynne. Reed called him as the sun came up. Wynne was a human who had spent most of his adult life in the telecommunications architecture of fringe space, which meant he understood how Accord communication systems were built, and more usefully, he understood all the ways they could be made to behave incorrectly. He was not Reed's friend exactly. They had worked together twice, years ago, and maintained contact in the way that people who operated in overlapping grey areas sometimes did. What Wynne provided, for the right compensation, was signal interference, the kind that didn't look like interference. The call connected and Wynne said, before Reed could speak, "You are in significantly more trouble than you usually call me about." "The Accord has a probe in orbit of my current position," Reed said. "I need the local communication relay scrambled for at least 48 hours, and I need it to look like atmospheric interference." "That's doable," Wynne said. "The harder problem is that an Accord cutter left Accord Station 714 hours ago on a trajectory that puts it here in about 16 hours. Commander Breva Soam commanding. She runs Accord biological recovery operations." Reed absorbed this. "She's good at her job," Wynne added. "I know," Reed said. He had looked her up in the night. Breva Soam had run 14 recovery operations in the past 6 years, all of them successful, all of them conducted by the book. She was not cruel. She was not careless. She was the kind of person who was more dangerous than either of those things, a person who genuinely believed that what she was doing was correct. "I need one more thing," Reed said. "I need transmission access to independent media networks, alien rights advocacy groups, and any Vreth diaspora contact points you can find." There was a pause. "Reed," Wynne said slowly. "I know. You're going loud." "I'm going loud." Another pause. "The scramble will buy you the 48 hours. The transmissions I can route so they don't trace back to your position, but once they go, they go. There's no taking it back." "I know," Reed said. "Send me the frequencies." He spent the next 3 hours with Soren. Soren had his own network, thin, stretched across fringe space, kept alive by Vreth exiles who communicated in small, careful ways that stayed just below the Accord's notice. He pulled out names and contact points that he had not used in years, frequencies for community nodes scattered across a dozen systems. Some of them might respond, some of them might not. But Soren knew which ones were worth trying, and he wrote them down with the careful handwriting of someone who had learned early that the things you kept only in your memory could be taken from you. Reed recorded everything while he wrote. He set up his personal camera on the shelter's shelf and recorded himself speaking clearly and without drama, explaining what he had found on Drathful, what Resolution 7 Gamma said and when it had expired, and what was currently sleeping on the thermal padding behind him. He recorded the hatchlings, Dravan investigating the camera with aggressive curiosity and leaving a nose smear on the lens. Sela sitting with her silver-edged scales, catching the morning light, watching everything. Wrath attempting to eat part of the shelter frame and being redirected by Soren, who had developed a very patient redirect and substitute system that worked about 60% of the time. He recorded Soren. Soren had not agreed to this immediately. He had been quiet for a long time, and then he had said that the last time Vreth had drawn public attention to themselves, it had not gone well. Reed had said that was true. And then Reed had said that the difference between then and now was that this time there were 3 hatchlings alive who the world had agreed were not supposed to exist, and that the only way to keep them alive was to make the world aware of that agreement and what it said about the world. Soren had thought about it. Then he had sat down in front of the camera and spoken in Vreth first, and then in the common trade language for 11 uninterrupted minutes. Reed did not know everything he said, but he knew the tone, and the tone was the kind that came from a person who had been quiet for a very long time and had finally decided that the cost of staying quiet was higher than the cost of being heard. They transmitted everything at midday. Wynne routed the signal through 3 relay points so it would land across every independent journalism node, alien rights advocacy channel, and Vreth diaspora contact on Soren's list simultaneously. Within the hour, Wynne confirmed the local relay was scrambled. The probe in orbit was sending nothing useful to anyone. Commander Soam's cutter would arrive in 4 hours. Reed and Soren sat outside the shelter with the hatchlings. Dravan had discovered that Reed's boots made an interesting sound when bitten and was testing this discovery methodically. Wrath was asleep in the sun, which seemed to be a significant life priority for him. Sela was sitting very still, looking at the sky, and Reed had the uncomfortable sense that she had been aware of the probe for longer than either of them. "We could still run," Soren said. "We could," Reed said. "But you won't." Reed watched Dravan abandon the boot and begin investigating the ship's landing strut instead. "I'm tired," he said simply, "not of this, of running from things that don't deserve to win. Whatever Soam is bringing, I'd rather face it standing here than find it behind me somewhere down the line." Soren looked at the sky. "The Vreth used to say," he said slowly, "that the place a person chooses to stand is more important than what weapons they carry when they stand there." "That sounds right," Reed said. "It sounds right," Soren agreed. "I always thought it sounded right. I had simply run out of places where it seemed worth standing." He paused. "Until now." The cutter's entry trail appeared in the sky at the edge of the afternoon. Reed watched it come down. Then he looked at his notes, folded neatly in his coat pocket, and felt something settle inside him. Not confidence exactly, more like the particular quiet that came from having done the preparation and having nothing left to do but follow through. "All right," he said, "let's go talk to her." The Accord cutter touched down 200 meters from Reed's camp with the precision of long practice. 6 officers came down the ramp in light enforcement gear, not combat equipment, which Reed noted and filed away. Commander Breva Soam came last. She was a tall woman of middle years with the kind of face that had spent a long time outdoors on difficult planets. Her uniform was clean. Her bearing was straight. She walked across the gray ground toward Reed and Soren without hurrying, and she did not reach for anything on her belt. Reed gave her credit for that. He was standing in front of the shelter. Soren stood to his left. Inside the shelter, the 3 hatchlings were awake. He could hear the sounds they made, but Soren had asked them, in quiet Vreth, to stay inside. Dravan had pushed his head through the shelter door flap twice already. Reed had pushed it back twice. Commander Soam stopped 10 meters away. "Reed Calloway," she said. Her voice was even and professional. "Salvage contractor, license number filed in the Drathval operational zone, currently carrying 3 unregistered Vreth hatchlings on unsanctioned ground. She paused. I am not here to be difficult, Mr. Calloway. I am here to carry out Accord Resolution 7 Gamma. I am asking you to step aside and allow us to collect the organisms. I appreciate the courtesy, Reed said. I have a few things to say before anyone moves anywhere. Soam looked at him. You have 60 seconds, she said. I'll try to be efficient, Reed said. He pulled his notes from his coat pocket, unfolded them, and began. Resolution 7 Gamma was passed on the 14th day of the 9th month of the war's final year, under emergency wartime powers authorized by the Accord Security Council. Those powers operated under Accord Constitutional Provision 14, which sets a maximum validity of 8 years from the date of passage for any emergency measure unless formally renewed by a full council vote. He looked up. 7 Gamma was never renewed. I pulled the council voting records last night. There is no renewal motion, no emergency extension, no formal review. The resolution expired 9 years ago. Every enforcement action taken under it since that date, including this one, has no legal foundation. Soam's expression did not change, but something shifted behind it. A small thing, the kind of shift that happened when a person encountered information they had not been briefed on. That is a legal interpretation, she said carefully. It's the text of Provision 14, Reed said. I can read you the specific clause if you'd like. He looked back at his notes. Second point, under Biological Rights Accord Supplement 3, Section 7, any organism displaying post-hatching cognitive response, individual personality differentiation, and voluntary social bonding within the first 30 standard days of life qualifies for provisional sapient youth status, which triggers a mandatory review period before any enforcement action can be taken. These 3 hatchlings hatched between 2 and 3 days ago. They have shown all 3 qualifying behaviors. I have footage recorded before this meeting which documents it. He paused. I have also filed provisional sapient youth protection requests through 3 independent advocacy offices under the Accord's own independent review system, filed this morning through my communications contact before your communications scramble. Those filings are time-stamped and logged. There was silence. One of the 6 officers shifted his weight slightly. Soam did not move at all. Filings of that kind require a licensed biological advocate to co-sign, she said. They require a licensed biological advocate or a recognized cultural representative of the species in question, Reed said. I found that in Supplement 3, Subarticle 4, which means Soren, who is Vreth, qualifies as a cultural representative for provisional filing purposes. He looked at Soren briefly, then back at Soam. He co-signed everything. Soam looked at Soren for the first time. Soren met her gaze without looking away. Then, inside the shelter, something happened. A sound came through the speaker unit that Soren had quietly connected to the shelter's external feed an hour ago. A voice, old and resonant, and in the Vreth language speaking words that clearly carried formal weight. Reed did not understand Vreth, but Soren had translated this part for him beforehand. The voice belonged to Elder Vyra. She was the oldest surviving Vreth elder and the recognized head of the largest Vreth diaspora community in fringe space. Soren had reached her community through his contact network the night before. Her statement was 12 minutes long. Soren had summarized it for Reed in 4 sentences. She formally recognized the 3 hatchlings as Vreth citizens by birthright. She invoked the Accord's own diaspora cultural rights framework to assert custodial authority on behalf of surviving Vreth communities. She notified the Accord that any action taken against the hatchlings would be treated as an act against the Vreth people as a whole. And she announced that the statement was already public and had been shared with every news channel and independent legal body she had contacts with, which was a considerable number. Soam listened to the voice from the speaker without interrupting it. When it ended, she was quiet for a moment. Then her comm unit began to receive messages, several at once. Reed could see the indicator light from where he was standing. She looked down at it, read something, looked up, read something else. In orbit, the Accord cutter was receiving communications too. Wynne had crashed the local Accord legal override relay 40 minutes ago. A technical fault, officially, one of those strange atmospheric electromagnetic events that happened in fringe space sometimes. Without the relay, Soam could not access the Accord's automated authorization system to escalate her enforcement order. She would need to wait for Central Command to respond to her manual request for guidance. And Central Command, Reed had gambled, was now being flooded with communications from every direction at once about 3 Vreth hatchlings on an uninhabited moon. Governments moved slowly when they were surprised. They moved even more slowly when they were surprised in public. Soam looked at Reed. "You prepared this specifically," she said. "Yes," he said. "You had all of this ready before we landed." "Yes." She was quiet for a long moment. The 6 officers behind her stood still, waiting for something to do and getting no instruction. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "I want you to understand that I was not given any of this information before this operation. What you've just described, the expiration of 7 Gamma, the supplement 3 provisions, none of that was in my briefing. I followed what I was told the law said." "I know," Reed said. "I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm just telling you what the law actually says." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the shelter flap, which Dravan had just pushed his head through again, regarding the row of Accord officers with open and somewhat aggressive curiosity. Something happened in Soam's face that was very brief and that she controlled quickly, but Reed saw it. "I need to withdraw to orbit and contact Central Command for clarification of my authorization," she said. "That sounds right," Reed said. "This is not a resolution, Mr. Calloway. This is a delay." "I'll take a delay," Reed said. "We can work with a delay." She looked at him for another moment, then she looked at Soren. 15 years ago," she said, quietly enough that only the 2 of them could hear it, "I was assigned to Drathval. After the war, I was junior grade then." She stopped. She did not say anything else about it. Soren looked at her. His expression was unreadable. Soam turned and walked back to the cutter. The 6 officers followed her. The ramp rose, the engines powered up. Reed stood and watched it go until the entry trail had faded out of the sky completely. Then he felt his legs decide they were done being held that stiff, and he sat down on the ground. Soren sat beside him. Dravan came out of the shelter and walked directly onto Reed's lap with the confidence of someone who had decided laps existed for exactly this purpose. Seela appeared at the shelter door and looked at the sky where the cutter had been, then back at Soren, then retreated inside. Wrath appeared a moment later, walked past both of them, found a patch of sun 3 meters away, and lay down in it. Soren made the sound again, the one from the shelter after the first hatching, the thing Reed had not known how to name. He knew now it was laughter, old, unused, finding its way back. "You argued with an Accord commander," Soren said, using her own laws. "That's usually where the best arguments come from," Reed said. Soren was quiet. "Then she will come back." "Yes," Reed said, "but next time she'll come with lawyers, not officers, and lawyers argue. And while they're arguing, we keep making noise, and Eldervira keeps making noise, and the diaspora communities keep making noise, and eventually something shifts." He paused. "That's how it works. It's slow and it's ugly, but it's how it works." Soren looked at Dravan, asleep now on Reed's lap. "You believe this," he said. Reed thought about it. "I believe that 3 things that weren't supposed to be alive are alive," he said. "I believe that Soam just walked away when she didn't have to. I believe that Eldervira's statement went to 100 outlets this morning." He looked at the red sky above the hills. "Something's already shifted. I can feel it." Soren was silent for a while. Then, for the first time since Reed had met him, he leaned back on his hands and looked at the sky without watching it for threats. "Tell me more about this plan," he said. Reed smiled. "Well," he said, "step 1 just worked. Let's talk about step 2. 3 months is not a long time to change anything." But 3 months is enough time to change one thing, and sometimes one thing is the hinge that everything else turns on. The planet was called Reth Dovar by the Vreth who settled it, which translated roughly as the ground we chose, with an implication layered in the original language that the choosing mattered as much as the ground itself. It was not on any Accord map. It was in fringe space, inside a system that the Accord had surveyed twice, found economically uninteresting, and never returned to, which made it, as far as Reed Calloway was concerned, perfect. Settlement was small, 11 structures built from local stone and reclaimed ship materials, set around a central yard that caught the afternoon sun in a way that Soren said was traditional. Vreth settlements oriented their communal spaces to the sun's longest hours. There were 43 Vreth here now, come in ones and twos and small family groups over the past 3 months, following the contact network that Soren had activated and Elder Vira's statement had amplified. Mori were coming. The numbers were not large. Against 15 years of loss, they were almost painfully small, but they were here and they were building, and that was the thing that mattered. Resolution 7 Gamma was suspended. This had happened 6 weeks after Commander Soam's withdrawal, when the Accord's own independent legal review board issued a preliminary finding that the resolution's enforcement mechanisms lacked current legal authorization, phrasing that was careful and bureaucratic and meant exactly what Reed had said to Soam on the grey ground of that unnamed moon. The suspension was not a repeal. A repeal would require a council vote, and council votes required politics, and politics required time. But suspension meant that no enforcement action could be taken under 7 Gamma while the review continued, which meant every Vreth egg, every hatchling, every diaspora community that had been operating quietly and carefully and in fear for 15 years could take a breath. Reed had attended the preliminary hearing remotely, by comlink, sitting in the settlement's one finished building while Sela climbed on the back of his chair and Rath sat on his foot, apparently under the impression that this was helpful. He had said what he needed to say. The rest had been done by lawyers, which was appropriate, because this was a thing that lawyers should have been doing for years and had simply not been asked to. After the hearing, Soren had come and found him and said, in the quiet, direct way that had become his normal mode of speaking, that the Vreth communities across fringe space were calling Reed by a word. Vrathkul. There was no clean translation. Soren had tried 3 times and finally said it meant something like the one who stands in front. Not in front to fight, necessarily, in front to be between the thing being protected and the thing doing harm. A Vrathkul was not a warrior by definition. The original usage, Soren explained, was for someone who stood in doorways. Reed had said he was not sure he deserved a word. Soren had said that in Vreth tradition, you did not get the word by feeling you deserved it. You got it by having stood there. Elder Vira arrived on Reth Dovar on a morning in the 3rd month, on a small transport that was older than Reed's ship and considerably more patched. She was smaller than Reed had imagined from her voice in the recording, compact, very still, with amber eyes that had seen enough of the world to have stopped being surprised by it and had come around the other side to something that was not quite peace, but was adjacent to it. She met Reed in the central yard and looked at him for a long time without speaking. Then she said, in accented trade language, I was told a human carried 3 eggs off Drathval. Yes, Reed said. In a salvage bag. It was well padded, Reed said. She looked at him a moment longer, then made a sound that Soren, from across the yard, recognized as laughter and smiled despite himself. Elder Vira spent 4 days on Reth Dovar. She spoke with every Vreth in the settlement. She walked through all 11 buildings. She sat with the hatchlings for 2 hours on the 2nd afternoon, which was a more demanding experience than it sounded, because in 3 months, Dravan, Sela, and Rath had grown with the focused intensity of things making up for lost time. Dravan was now large enough to knock a person over and had discovered this ability approximately once a day with what appeared to be genuine delight. Sela had developed the habit of appearing in places without anyone having seen her arrive, which was somewhat unnerving in an enclosed settlement. Rath remained large, unhurried, and personally convinced that everything in the known universe was potentially edible until proven otherwise. He had eaten part of a structural beam the previous week. The beam had needed to be replaced. But they were alive, growing, loud and difficult and completely themselves in the ways that young things were when they had been allowed to be. On her last evening, Elvira sat with Reed outside the settlement while the sun went down over the hills. "You did not know what you were doing," she said. "It was not an accusation. It was the kind of statement that was looking for confirmation." "Not entirely," Reed said. "But you did it anyway." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Why, the true answer, not the comfortable one? Reed thought about it. It was the same question Soren had asked him weeks ago, and he had given a simple answer then. He tried to give an honest one now. "I found 3 living things that the rest of the world had decided weren't worth the trouble of keeping alive," he said, "and it seemed like a problem I could do something about." Elvira looked at the darkening hills. "Simple," she said. "Usually the real reasons are," Reed said. She left the next morning. Soren saw her off at the landing pad and stood there for a long time after the transport had cleared the atmosphere, looking at the sky. Reed came and stood beside him. "She told me," Soren said, "that the Vreth who came back to the settlements last generation, the ones who tried to rebuild after the first collapse, they used to argue about what would bring the people home. Some said territory, some said political standing, some said cultural preservation." He paused. "Nobody said it would be 3 eggs in a salvage bag." "Things usually start smaller than the story makes them sound," Reed said. Soren looked at him. "Will you stay?" Reed looked at the settlement. The 11 buildings, the central yard catching the afternoon light, the small and growing thing that was being built here one day at a time. "For a while," he said. "Your license is probably revoked." "Definitely revoked," Reed said. "I checked." Soren almost smiled. Behind them, from the direction of the central yard, there came the distinctive sound of something very large moving very fast, followed immediately by a solid impact, and then Reed's boots leaving the ground entirely as Dravan hit him from behind at full running speed, all of his considerable weight and enthusiasm arriving at once. Reed went down. He landed on his back in the dirt of Rethdovar, with the wind knocked out of him, and 3 young dragons immediately taking this as an invitation. Dravan stretched across his chest. Wrath arrived at a lumbering trot and settled across his legs with the comfortable authority of someone who had decided this spot was his. Seela appeared from somewhere, nobody had seen her coming, and curled against his side, her silver-edged scales warm in the afternoon light. Reed lay flat on the ground, completely buried, looking up at the sky. The sky above Rethdovar was a deep clear blue at the height of the afternoon, a kind of blue that felt like it had never had anything bad happen under it, which Reed knew was not true and didn't matter. Soren looked down at him from a standing position with the expression of a person watching someone get exactly what they had asked for. "You could have reported the eggs," Soren said. "I could have," Reed agreed, "from under approximately 400 kilograms of young dragon. You could have taken the finder's fee and walked away." "Could have. Everything would have been simpler." Reed thought about this. Dravan shifted, which redistributed some weight in a way that was not more comfortable. Wrath made a sound like a very large engine idling. Seela's scales were warm against his arm. "Yeah," Reed said. He did not move. He was not going to move. Above him, Rethdovar's sun continued its arc across the blue, and the settlement made its small sounds of people building something, and the 3 young dragons breathed in the slow, steady rhythm of things that had no memory of the world that had not wanted them in it, and did not need one. Some things were worth the trouble. Reed had known that before. He just hadn't had a reason to act on it in a while. He had one now. He had 3.